The first thing Alucard noticed about Raccoon City was the smell. Not the smell of the dead. He'd been marinating in that particular perfume since roughly 1462 and had long since made his peace with it. No, what hit him the moment he materialized on the corner of Innerdale Street and whatever the locals had optimistically named Hope Avenue was something far more offensive to his ancient and refined sensibilities. The smell of bad science. There was a particular quality to it. The T-virus, he would later learn its name, had a signature somewhere between a hospital that had given up and a meat locker that had gained ambition. It clung to the October air like a corporate memo nobody had the courage to file. It was, in a word, pedestrian. He stood there for a moment, impeccably dressed in his red coat and ridiculous hat, both of which had survived the dimensional transit without so much as a wrinkle, because the universe had long since learned not to inconvenience him sartorially, and surveyed what appeared to be a mid-size American city in the process of eating itself. Zombies everywhere, dozens of them shambling through overturned police barricades, past burning squad cars, through the shattered windows of a pharmacy that had, ironically, been unable to provide what its customers now needed most. They moved with that particular combination of biological urgency and total cognitive vacancy that Alucard associated with middle management, and they were, frankly, everywhere. He tilted his head. Huh, he said, to no one in particular. A zombie turned toward the sound of his voice, fixing him with the milky, necrotic gaze of something that had once been a man and was now significantly less interesting. It opened its mouth. Something that may have been a groan emerged, though Alucard was generous enough to interpret it as a greeting. Yeah, he said. Same. The zombie lurched forward. Alucard watched it cover the distance between them with the patience of a man who had genuinely nothing better to do. When it got close enough that its teeth clicked together, approximately 2 inches from his nose, he reached out with one gloved hand, took it by the face with the casual intimacy of someone handling a particularly disappointing cantaloupe, and held it at arm's length. It kept walking. Its legs pumped against air. Its jaw kept working. You're dead, Alucard observed, with the tone of a man reading a weather report. You're already dead, and you're still doing this. He turned the zombie slightly, examining it from different angles like a jeweler assessing a stone that had turned out to be glass. That's either the most relatable thing I've ever seen or the saddest. I genuinely can't decide. He dropped it. It got back up. He watched it turn toward him again with something that might, in a different man, have been called melancholy. This was the problem. In his considerable experience, and he had more experience than anyone currently living and most of the dead, there were 2 categories of opponent that made existence worth the bother. The first was the kind that could actually hurt him, the kind that made his blood sing and his shadows lean forward with interest. The second was the kind that thought they could hurt him, which was almost better, because at least the performance had entertainment value. Raccoon City's undead population qualified as neither. He shot the zombie, not because it posed a threat. The Casul's .454 round removed the top half of its head, with the kind of thoroughness that precluded further argument, and it went down in a way that suggested it was not getting back up. But because he needed to do something with his hands, the gunshot echoed down the street like a stone dropped into a very deep well. Every zombie within 2 blocks turned toward the sound. Alucard looked at the small army of lurching dead, now orienting themselves in his direction, and felt the first genuine flicker of something in what had already been a profoundly uninteresting evening. Not excitement exactly, more like the faint, distant cousin of curiosity that visits when you're bored enough. Okay, he said, drawing the jackal with his other hand. Let's at least see if volume helps. It took him 4 minutes to clear the street. He counted. The familiars inside him stirred at the edges of his consciousness, drawn by the sudden influx of death, and he told them to go back to sleep. These weren't worth consuming, barely worth the ammunition, barely worth the effort of reloading. He did it anyway, methodically, walking down Hope Avenue with both guns out, and his coat sweeping through puddles of something he chose not to identify, because the alternative was standing still, and the alternative was boredom, and boredom, in his considered opinion, was the only thing in creation that could actually threaten him. The city burned at the edges. Somewhere to the north, A gas main had given up and taken a city block with it. Helicopters that had stopped answering. Distress calls hours ago sat in pieces on rooftops. And beneath it all, threading through the carnage like a baseline nobody had asked for, was the steady, wet sound of something that used to be human learning new ways to move. He reloaded. Integra, he said, to the air, in the specific tone he used when he wanted her to know he was having a terrible time and she was responsible. You'll be pleased to know I've arrived in America. The hospitality is not what I was led to expect. He waited for a response that did not come because he was, as far as he could determine, several dimensions away from anyone who could hear him. He found this not troubling exactly, more like inconvenient in the way that a minor weather event was inconvenient. Annoying, atmospheric, ultimately beneath his concern. He was in a dead city. The dead were already here. The living, presumably, were somewhere in the process of either surviving or joining them. He was, for foreseeable future, on his own. He considered this for exactly 3 seconds, which was approximately 2 seconds and 58 seconds, longer than it deserved. Fine, Alucard said. To Raccoon City, to the burning cars, to the October sky above a quarantine zone that had already failed, to every zombie still shambling in his direction from the far end of the block. We'll do it the interesting way. He put his hat down slightly over one eye, in the manner of a man preparing for an evening he has already decided to enjoy, despite every reasonable objection, and walked north into the city, toward the distant wail of something that sounded like a police radio that hadn't given up yet. 3 blocks away, in the wreckage of a traffic pileup on Raccoon City's main arterial road, a young police officer named Leon Scott Kennedy was having the worst first day of work in documented human history. He was crouched behind the engine block of an overturned cruiser, shotgun in his hands, watching 4 zombies circle the car with the methodical, terrible patience of things that had no concept of giving up. He had 7 shells left. He had a handgun with a full magazine and 2 spares. He had a first aid kit with 1 spray remaining. He had been on the job for approximately 6 hours, none of which had involved anything he had been trained for, and he was operating on the specific variety of adrenaline-driven calm that kicks in when the human brain runs out of room to panic and simply begins processing. He had made it this far on training, stubbornness, and the kind of refusal to die that read less like courage and more like his brain simply hadn't received the memo that this was unsurvivable. He was about to make his move on the 4 zombies, pick them off at distance, conserve the shotgun, when something at the far end of the road made every one of them stop. They turned, as one, away from him. Leon looked up over the hood of the cruiser. A figure in a red coat was walking down the middle of the road. Walking, not running, not jogging. Walking, with his hands in his pockets and his head tilted slightly, like a man taking an evening stroll, who had found the neighborhood aesthetically interesting. The 4 zombies that had been circling Leon's car lurched toward the figure. The figure watched them come, and then, with a speed that Leon's eyes refused to correctly process, both hands came out of his pockets and the street lit up with 4 precise, deafening shots, and all 4 zombies were simply gone. Silence. The figure in the red coat looked at the space where they'd been, then looked down the road at Leon. Leon looked back. "Hey," the figure called, in a tone of voice that suggested this was all very mildly amusing. "You alive?" Leon stood up from behind the cruiser, shotgun still in his hands, because he had been alive for 21 years and had survived 6 hours of Raccoon City and was not about to start making assumptions about the people pointing guns in his general direction. "Yeah," he called back. The figure tilted his head in the other direction, studying Leon with the specific expression of someone who has just found something they didn't expect and isn't sure yet whether to be pleased about it. "Interesting." Leon kept the shotgun up. "Who are you?" The figure smiled. It was not, Leon would reflect later, a smile that belonged on a human face. It was too wide, too knowing, and entirely too comfortable for a man standing in the middle of a zombie apocalypse at 1 in the morning. "Someone who's been here for 45 minutes, the figure said, "and is already deeply disappointed by everything except you." He paused. "You can put the gun down. It's decorative at this point." Leon did not put the gun down. The figure's smile got fractionally wider, in a way that suggested this was somehow the correct answer. If you want to see more characters survive different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments. The infection never truly ends. Leon Kennedy had, in the past 6 hours, been chased by things that used to be people, watched his entire understanding of the world dissolve like wet paper, and personally witnessed a zombie bite through a car door with enough force to leave dental impressions in the steel. He had recalibrated his threat assessment scale 3 times already tonight, and each recalibration had involved moving the previous maximum to quaint. The man in the red coat was already somewhere above the new maximum, and he hadn't done anything yet except smile. Leon Kennedy, Leon said, because if this was going to be a conversation, he was at least going to conduct it like a professional. RPD, Alucard, the figure said. He said it the way people said names they'd had long enough that the name had stopped being a label and become a fact. Not RPD. I can see that. Leon kept the shotgun at a low ready, not aimed, not holstered, occupying the diplomatic middle ground between hostility and trust that his training had categorized as situational awareness, and his instincts were currently categorizing as please don't let this man be another thing. I have to shoot you with umbrella? Something shifted in Alucard's expression. It wasn't quite offense. It was more like the look of chess. Grandmaster might give a pawn. Being asked if he played checkers. What an interesting question, he said. To ask the person who just cleared your street for you. People do things for reasons. Leon moved out from behind the cruiser. Keeping distance, keeping the shotgun accessible, doesn't mean the reasons are good. Alucard looked at him for a long moment with those dark, incomprehensible eyes that Leon's brain kept trying to read and kept sliding off of, like trying to find purchase on a surface that had decided not to have any, and then made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. It had the shape of a laugh, without quite the warmth. You, Alucard said, are going to be annoying in the best possible way. Thanks, Leon said flatly. What are you? Specific. Alucard tilted his head. A zombie rounded the corner at the far end of the block and he shot it without looking. The casul coming up and going back down in a motion so fluid it barely qualified as an interruption. I'm a vampire. The vampire, technically, though I try not to lead with that because it makes conversations go strange. Leon stared at him. Stranger, Alucard amended, with a gesture that encompassed the burning city around them. The thing was, Leon reflected, that he had been standing in a city full of the walking dead for 6 hours. He had watched a man in a suit absorb 12 shotgun shells and keep coming. He had seen a woman's jaw detach and continue operating, independently of her skull. His threshold for that's not possible had been demolished so thoroughly that the rubble wasn't even visible anymore. A vampire, in this context, was less a revelation and more an administrative update. Okay, Leon said. Alucard blinked. It was a very small blink. But Leon got the impression it was the closest thing to surprise he was going to see on that face. Okay, Leon repeated. Are you going to kill me? I kill things that can die interestingly, Alucard said. You're doing something more valuable than that right now. What am I doing? Existing. He said it with the gravity of a man who had watched most things. Stopped doing exactly that and had opinions about the ones that kept going, against considerable evidence to the contrary. He looked Leon up and down once. Assessing. First day on the job? Leon's jaw tightened. That obvious? The badge is still clean. Alucard started walking north, apparently having decided the conversation was better conducted in motion. Also, you're alive, which suggests you haven't had time to develop the specific death wish that comes with several years of this. He paused. Where are you trying to get to? Leon fell into step beside him, because the alternative was staying alone on a street that was already beginning to fill again at the far end, and because something about Alucard's complete indifference to the surrounding apocalypse created a gravitational pull that was difficult to resist when you were 21 and scared, and trying very hard not to show either. Police station, he said. RPD headquarters. Trying to find survivors, establish contact, figure out what's happening. What's happening? Alucard said pleasantly. Is that someone put a pathogen in the water supply, or the air, or both, that reanimates dead tissue and degrades living cognitive function. and the corporation responsible has decided that losing the city is preferable to admitting they did it. He shot two lickers off a building facade without breaking stride, the sound of their bodies hitting the pavement punctuating the sentence like particularly emphatic periods. The government knows. They're deciding how to clean it up. Clean it up, in this context, meaning the kind of cleaning that leaves a crater. Leon stopped walking. How do you know that? I've seen it before. Alucard glanced back at him. Different century, different pathogen, same corporate logic. The arithmetic of culpability always resolves the same way. Cheaper to burn the evidence than pay for it. His voice carried no particular heat when he said this. It was an observation, not an accusation, the tone of someone reporting a weather pattern that had been consistent for 500 years and showed no signs of changing. Raccoon City has maybe 72 hours before someone with a very clean conscience and a very large bomb decides the math works out. There are people still alive in there. Yes. That doesn't. Leon started and stopped. And the thing that stopped him was the expression on Alucard's face. Not cruelty, not indifference, but something that was almost worse, a patient, exhausted recognition. The look of someone who had made this argument before and knew exactly where it ended. No, Alucard agreed, quietly. It doesn't. They walked for a moment in silence, broken only by the distant sound of something large moving several streets over, something that walked with a heaviness that the dead didn't have, a deliberate, methodical weight that Leon's nervous system registered before his brain caught up with it. What is that? Leon said. Something more interesting than zombies, Alucard said. And he sounded, despite everything, fractionally more alive. We should walk faster. The Raccoon City Police Department building emerged from the smoke and the dark like a monument to optimism that had been proven badly wrong. Its architecture, neoclassical, vaguely European, the kind of civic building that had been designed to communicate permanence and authority, was largely intact, which made the blood on the front steps and the zombie pressed against the main entrance glass feel particularly incongruous. The emergency lighting inside cast everything in a red that had nothing to do with aesthetics. Leon assessed the entrance. Two zombies at the main door, manageable. Windows on the second floor showing movement, could be survivors. Could be more infected, no way to tell from street level. The side entrance, partially obscured by an overturned police van, looked quieter. Side door, he said. Front door, Alucard said. Leon looked at him. It's faster, Alucard said. And I've been walking through the wrong kind of door all night. Before, Leon could object to this on any of the several reasonable grounds available to him. Alucard was already at the front entrance, and the two zombies pressed against the glass were already not a problem anymore, and the door was open, and he was holding it with the specific courtesy of a man who had been raised in an era when holding doors was the minimum social obligation and had never quite unlearned it despite 5 centuries of subsequent moral complexity. Leon went through the door. The interior of the RPD hit him like a physical thing, the smell of blood and something biological. Underneath it, the wet, copper weight of a building that had become something it was never designed to be. Emergency lighting painted the entry hall in deep red shadows. Filing cabinets had been overturned. A desk sergeant's station showed signs of a struggle that had not ended well for the desk sergeant. From deeper in the building, something moved. Something that wasn't shambling. Something that was hunting. Leon brought the shotgun up. Alucard stood beside him, both guns holstered, hands loose at his sides, with the relaxed readiness of someone who had decided that the situation did not yet require effort. The ceiling, Alucard said, with the conversational tone of a man pointing out an architectural feature of mild interest. Leon looked up. The liquor was already dropping. The liquor hit the floor between them with a sound like a butcher's, counter-achieving sentience, all wet muscle and exposed biology and the specific wrongness of something that had decided skin was optional. It was enormous, larger than the RPD. Incident reports would later fail to describe accurately because the RPD incident reports were never going to be written with a brain glistening in the emergency lighting like something that deeply resented being visible and a tongue that uncoiled to roughly 4 feet as it oriented itself toward the nearest source of sound. Leon had read the file. Theoretically, the file had not adequately prepared him for the reality of something that hunted purely by acoustics, that had traded its eyes for a sensory apparatus so refined it could track a heartbeat through 2 floors of concrete, that moved with a speed that made his shotgun feel like a strongly worded letter. He did not move. He did not breathe. He stood with the absolute, crystalline stillness of a man who had processed the tactical situation in approximately 1/4 of a second and arrived at do not make a sound with the kind of conviction that bypasses conscious thought entirely. The licker's head swiveled. Its tongue tasted the air. Its claws, each one a curved surgical implement that the evolutionary process had sharpened over iterations Leon didn't want to think about, clicked against the marble floor with a delicacy that was somehow more terrifying than if it had simply charged. Beside him, Alucard said, at perfectly normal conversational volume, "So these things are blind?" The licker screamed, not a vocalization exactly, more like every frequency of wrongness condensed into a single acoustic event, and launched itself at the source of the sound. Leon Dove left. Pure instinct, no thought, the kind of movement that the body makes when the brain has temporarily vacated the premises in favor of something faster. He hit the floor behind an overturned desk, brought the shotgun up, and put 2 shells into the licker's flank as it sailed over him, which did not stop it but redirected its trajectory into a filing cabinet that collapsed under the impact with a crash that would absolutely attract everything in the building. He was already moving before the cabinet hit the floor, circling right, looking for a clean angle. And then he stopped because Alucard was in the way. Alucard, who had not moved. The licker righted itself from the cabinet wreckage, fast, obscenely fast. The wounds in its flank already weeping. Something that wasn't quite blood, and fixed its sightless orientation on Alucard with the focused, total attention of something that had decided this was the priority target. It crossed the distance in under a second. Alucard caught its tongue. He caught it the way you catch a thrown rope. One hand up. Casual, the whipping 4-foot appendage wrapping twice around his fist as the licker's full momentum transferred into the point of contact. The licker jerked to a halt, so sudden it was almost comic, suspended in mid-lunge by the fact that Alucard had simply stopped it, his feet not moving, his expression suggesting he was performing a task that fell somewhere between mildly engaging and light housework. The licker thrashed. Its claws scored the marble floor in long parallel gouges. Its body twisted with the full hydraulic force of musculature that had been optimized by a bioweapon for exactly this kind of violence. Alucard looked at it with his head tilted slightly to the left. He said. Then he swung it into the floor hard enough that the marble cracked, and the licker stopped moving, and the building went quiet except for the drip of something from the ceiling, and the distant, rhythmic sound of the heavy footsteps that had followed them from 3 streets over and were now, Leon noted with a cold clarity, significantly closer. Leon stood up from behind the desk. He looked at the licker. He looked at Alucard. He looked at the cracked marble, which had not cracked, because the building was old or the stone was weak, but because something had hit it with enough force to make the crack a statement. You could have just shot it, Leon said. I could have, Alucard agreed pleasantly. But then I wouldn't know if they can be caught by the tongue, which turns out to be yes, and now we both know that. And knowledge is valuable. He released the tongue, which flopped to the floor, with a sound Leon was going to spend considerable effort forgetting. You're welcome. You attracted every infected thing in the building. Also yes, he didn't seem troubled by this. Think of it as efficiency. Better to deal with them now than find them in inconvenient places later. He looked up at the ceiling with an expression of mild professional assessment. How many floors? 3 main, plus basement and sub-basement. Leon was already moving toward the eastern corridor, keeping his footfalls controlled, scanning doorways. Armories on the 1st floor east wing. If there are survivors, they're probably in the main hall or the upper offices. The stairs create natural choke points that he stopped. Alucard was looking at him with that expression again, the one Leon couldn't quite read. Attentive, in the way that things with very good hearing were attentive, but also something else, something that felt uncomfortably like being studied. What? Leon said. Nothing. Alucard fell into step beside him. You're good at this. I've been here 6 hours. I know. That's what I said. He said it without irony, which somehow made it worse, because it meant he meant it. And the idea of this particular entity meaning something complimentary about Leon's survival instincts was the kind of information his brain didn't have a filing system for yet. 3 floors above them, in a monitoring station that had no business existing inside a police department and whose presence in the building's architectural plans was buried under 7 layers of municipal paperwork that all traced back to a shell company, that traced back to another shell company, that traced back to a Zurich address that hadn't had a human occupant since 1991. A man named Operative Yates was having a professional crisis. He had been stationed in the RPD monitoring post for 11 months. His job was data collection, cataloging the outbreak's progression, flagging anomalies in infection spread patterns, maintaining the uplink to the Umbrella Network's Raccoon City Division server. It was unglamorous work. It was the kind of work that existed in the organizational chart 3 levels below the kind of work anyone admitted to doing at dinner parties. He was good at it. He was thorough, he was quiet, and he had the specific combination of intellectual incuriosity and professional compliance that Umbrella's HR division had learned over decades to identify and cultivate. Tonight had broken him. He had watched on the monitor feeds that covered the RPD's main entrance and entry hall a man in a red coat walk through a zombie outbreak like it was a mild inconvenience. He had watched him catch a licker by the tongue, and use it as a bludgeoning instrument against reinforced marble flooring. He had watched this same man engage in what appeared to be casual conversation throughout, displaying no physiological stress indicators, no elevated movement, no erratic behavior, no signs of the adrenaline response that every other living thing in Raccoon City was currently drowning in. He had run the footage through the anomaly detection protocol 3 times. The protocol, which had been designed to flag unusual BOW behavior and novel viral mutation patterns, returned the same result each time. Unclassified entity. Threat level. Incalculable. Escalate immediately. The incalculable part was what got him. The system had threat level categories up to Tyrant class, which was the ceiling, which was the designation reserved for the T-00, and the Nemesis T, and the kind of things that made hunk charge hazard pay. The anomaly detection protocol had apparently encountered something outside its categorical framework and responded by inventing a new category on the spot. Yates looked at the screen. He looked at the incalculable. He thought about 11 months of careful, quiet, unglamorous work. And then he thought about what happened to Umbrella employees who escalated reports of things that didn't fit the filing system. And then he thought about what appeared to be happening on the monitor feed right now, where the unclassified entity and the rookie cop were moving through his building with the comfortable coordination of people who had decided to work together. And he picked up the encrypted satellite phone. It rang twice before someone picked up. "This is Research Division Priority Line," said the voice on the other end, with the careful neutrality of someone trained to receive bad news without reacting to it. "This is Operative Yates, RPD monitoring post," Yates said. "I need to file an anomaly report under file designation 00 red. A pause. 00 red is the occult research classification. That file hasn't been activated in. I know what file it is," Yates said. "I'm activating it." He looked at the monitor. The red-coated figure had paused in the east corridor and appeared to be looking directly at a camera that was concealed behind a ventilation grill and had never, in 11 months of operation, been detected by anyone. "And I need you to pull whatever we have on dimensional incursion protocol, because I think the Arkley Team SEAL experiment just became our problem." On the monitor, the figure in the red coat smiled at the hidden camera. Yates felt, for the first time in 11 months of careful professional distance, genuinely afraid. "Also," he said, into the phone, very quietly, "tell Dr. Isaacs that whatever budget he allocated for the occult containment unit, he's going to want to double it." The voice on the other end said something that was supposed to be reassuring. It wasn't. The armory was intact. This was, Leon had decided, the single piece of good news Raccoon City had produced in the last 6 hours, and he was going to appreciate it with the focused gratitude of a man who understood that good news had a short shelf life in a city that was currently consuming itself. The door had been locked from the inside, which meant someone with a key had locked it, which meant someone with a key had been alive long enough to think about locking it, which meant there was at least a possibility that person was still alive, somewhere in the building. He broke the lock with a technique that his training categorized as emergency entry and his conscience categorized as technically fine given the circumstances, and the door swung open on shelves of ammunition, weapon racks, a first aid cabinet that made him exhale with something close to relief, and a smell of gun oil and clean metal that was the closest thing to normalcy he'd encountered since arriving in Raccoon City. He moved through the armory with efficient, methodical purpose, shotgun shells, handgun rounds, a combat knife to replace the one he'd left in something that hadn't deserved it, 2 cans of first aid spray. He was reaching for a shoulder holster when he realized Alucard hadn't followed him in. He was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, looking at the weapon racks with an expression of polite, anthropological interest, the look of someone visiting a culture whose tools they found quaint. "You could resupply," Leon said. "I have my guns. Your guns run out of ammunition eventually." "Eventually," Alucard agreed, in a tone that suggested eventually was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, and that he and Leon had very different relationships with the concept of ammunition dependency. Leon checked the Casal and the Jackal from across the room. Both guns were enormous. Both had custom modifications that no standard gunsmith would recognize, and both had the specific quality of weapons that had been made for a particular person and would be deeply unhappy in anyone else's hands. He filed this information and moved on, because the armory had given him something more immediately useful than a debate about firepower philosophy. On the floor, half concealed behind an overturned ammunition crate, was a radio, not a standard RPD unit. This one had a STARS frequency band, the specialized channel that Raccoon City's Special Tactics and Rescue Squad had used before. STARS had been dissolved, and its members had scattered into the various categories of dead, missing, and probably wishing they were either. It was still transmitting, faintly, intermittently, with the specific quality of a signal that was being broadcast from somewhere very close and had been broadcasting for a while without response. Leon picked it up and keyed the transmit button. "This is Officer Leon Kennedy, RPD. Is anyone on this frequency?" Static. Then, threading through it like something that had been waiting for exactly this, a woman's voice, controlled and precise, with the particular quality of someone maintaining composure through an act of sustained professional will. "This is Claire Redfield, civilian. I'm in the RPD main hall, second floor, with 2 survivors." "Who am I talking to?" "Leon Kennedy. First day, long story." He was already moving back toward the corridor. "Are you mobile? Can you get to the East Wing stairwell?" "Working on it. We've got infected between us and the stairs, 3 that I can see. Maybe more I can't." A pause, and then, with the careful neutrality of someone who had also had a very long 6 hours. "Is that gunfire I'm hearing in the East Wing, or something worse?" Leon looked at Alucard, who had apparently decided the conversation was interesting enough to pay attention to and was listening with his head tilted at the angle that Leon was already learning. "Men, I find this development mildly entertaining." "Gunfire," Leon said. Mostly, Claire repeated, with the tone of someone updating their threat assessment in real time. "Great. I'll be at the stairwell in 5 minutes. We'll come to you," Leon said. "Stay put, stay quiet." He pocketed the radio and looked at Alucard. "There are survivors upstairs. We're going to get them." Alucard said. "You've been following me since Innerdale Street." "I've been walking in the same direction as you since Innerdale Street." He pushed off the doorframe. "There's a difference." "Is there?" A pause. The building settled around them. The creak of structural stress. The distant wet movement of infected in corridors that hadn't been cleared yet. The persistent heavy rhythm of something outside that was getting closer in the specific way that things with no concept of hurrying could still somehow convey urgency through sheer inevitability. "No," Alucard admitted, with the grace of someone conceding a point they'd never actually been willing to contest. "Not really. The east stairwell was a masterclass in the geography of bad decisions. Someone had barricaded the ground floor, landing with furniture that had seemed like a good idea at the time and had since become a navigational obstacle that favored the infected, who didn't need to navigate so much as push through things, over the living, who had to. Leon dismantled enough of it to create a passage, moving quietly, efficiently, with the specific economy of motion that came from understanding that every unnecessary sound was an invitation. Alucard watched him work. "You're thinking about the footsteps outside?" Leon said, without looking up. "I'm thinking about several things. The footsteps specifically. A beat." "They stopped," Alucard said. Leon stopped moving. He listened. The heavy, methodical rhythm that had been threading through the buildings. Ambient sound for the last 15 minutes was gone. Not faded, gone. With the abrupt completeness of something that had reached its destination. "That's worse," Leon said. "Usually is." The second floor landing opened onto a corridor that had been through something. Evidence of a fight. Not the chaotic scatter of people running from infected, but the deliberate, targeted violence of a confrontation that had been conducted with intent. Shell casings. A STARS badge on the floor that Leon didn't pick up because the moment he picked it up it became something he had to think about. A door at the far end hanging off one hinge with something that had once been a hunter lying in pieces on the floor beyond it. Pieces. Not a dead hunter. Pieces. Leon looked at Alucard. "That was here when I arrived," Alucard said, with the specific innocence of someone who was technically telling the truth. "You've been in the building before tonight." "I've been in this corridor for about 40 minutes before tonight." He stepped over the hunter remains with the careful footwork of someone avoiding a puddle. "I was looking for something interesting. Settled for the armory camera feed, which led to you." He paused. The hunter was already in pieces. "I may have introduced it to the floor more firmly than was strictly necessary, but the pieces were pre-existing." "Why were you watching the armory camera?" "Because the camera was watching me first." He said it simply, without accusation. "Your monitoring station on the third floor has been tracking my movements since the entry hall. Whoever's running it is very thorough and very frightened, which means they work for someone with resources and they've decided I'm above their pay grade." He glanced at Leon. "Which is correct." Leon absorbed this, added it to the growing file of things about tonight that he was going to need to process extensively when he had the luxury of time, which at current trajectory looked like never. Umbrella has a monitoring post inside the RPD. "Someone does." "This city," Leon said under his breath, with a comprehensiveness that didn't require elaboration. "They found Claire Redfield on the second floor landing, exactly where she'd said she'd be," which told Leon something useful about her before she'd said another word. She was 20 years old, maybe, with the look of someone who'd been through enough tonight to have permanently updated her priors about the world. And she had a handgun that she kept pointed at Alucard for approximately 4 seconds after introductions before reholstering it with the pragmatic assessment of someone who had decided that if he'd wanted them dead, they'd already be dead. Behind her, 2 survivors, an older man with a pharmacist's ID badge and a teenage girl who was holding herself together with the specific determination of someone who had decided that falling apart was a problem for later. Pressed against the wall with the expressions of people who had run out of capacity for new information and were processing on a deficit. "Ease," Claire started, looking at Alucard. "Complicated," Leon said. "Sure." Claire looked at Alucard with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who read people well and had decided that reading this particular person was going to require a different methodology than usual. "You going to help us get out of here?" Alucard looked at her, then at the 2 survivors, then at Leon. The expression on his face moved through something, not sentiment. Exactly, because sentiment implied a warmth he wasn't going to claim, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of a quality in the assembled group that he had encountered, rarely enough that it still registered. Stubborn, his expression said. All of them. Infuriatingly, uselessly, beautifully stubborn. "I'm going to help him get you out of here," Alucard said, nodding at Leon. "There's a distinction." "Is there?" Claire said. The exact same question Leon had asked 20 minutes ago. The exact same inflection. Alucard's smile did something complicated. I'm starting to see a pattern, he said. The building shook. Not the structural groan of stress. Not the distant rumble of a gas main giving up. This was a single, concussive impact from the ground floor. The kind of sound a wall makes when something has decided. The wall is a suggestion rather than an obstacle, and the floor vibrated with a single footstep that followed it. Heavy and deliberate and absolutely certain of itself. The survivors pressed harder against the wall. Claire brought her gun up. Leon racked the shotgun. Alucard went very, very still. It was not the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of a predator that has heard, for the first time in a long evening of disappointments, something that might be worth paying attention to. There we go, he said, very quietly, and he sounded, despite everything, like a man whose night had just improved. The T-00 came through the stairwell. Door like the door had personally offended it. This was not metaphor. The reinforced fire door, steel core, hydraulic hinge, the kind of door that existed, specifically because someone had once sat in a room and asked what is the most door a door can be, ceased to be a door in any meaningful sense when the tyrant's fist connected with it. It became a projectile. It covered the distance between the stairwell and the far wall of the second-floor corridor in approximately 1/4 of a second and embedded itself there with a finality that precluded discussion. The T-00 stepped through the frame it had created. 7.5 feet. Slate gray skin pulled tight. Over a physiology that had been engineered to be the last thing a person saw, wearing the remnants of a long coat that had been chosen. Leon dimly recalled from a briefing he'd received 6 months ago, in what now felt like a different geological era, specifically to make it look more human, and had achieved the opposite effect. Its face was a blunt instrument. Its eyes, single-minded, mission-specific, scanning the corridor with the patient, mechanical thoroughness of a targeting system, found Leon first, then found Alucard. It stopped. This was notable. The T-00's behavioral programming, as Leon understood it from the briefing that felt like ancient history, did not include stop. It included pursue, eliminate, adapt to resistance, and continue pursuing. The concept of pause was not in the operational vocabulary of something that had been designed from the cellular level up to be unstoppable. And yet, it stood in the doorframe it had manufactured and looked at. Alucard with the closest approximation to uncertainty that a thing without a functional limbic system could produce. Alucard looked back at it. Hello, he said. The T-00 took one step forward. The floor registered its weight like a complaint. You're a tyrant, Alucard said, with the tone of a man reading a menu and finding the options acceptable. T-series, if I'm reading the cellular structure correctly, which I am, because I've been drinking blood since before your corporate parent company's founder was a bad idea in his grandfather's head. He tilted his head. Someone sent you specifically, didn't they? You changed direction on the ground floor. You were tracking something else, and then you weren't. His eyes moved, briefly, to the ceiling, to the concealed camera in the ventilation grill that was absolutely still transmitting, to the monitoring station on the 3rd floor. Someone upstairs gave you a new target. Leon kept the shotgun up and moved the survivors back along the corridor wall, creating distance, keeping himself between the tyrant and Claire's group without making it obvious he was doing it, because the last thing panicking people needed was to feel like they were being herded. Leon, Claire said quietly. I know. What is he doing? I genuinely don't know, Leon said. And I've decided to be okay with that. What Alucard was doing, specifically, was walking toward the T-00, not circling it, not flanking it, not employing any of the tactical geometries that Leon's training had provided for, engaging superior physical threats, walking toward it in a straight line, with his hands loose, at his sides and his coat moving, with the particular gravity of something that had decided this was the direction, and the direction was final. The T-00 swung. The fist that came at Alucard had enough force behind it to have redesigned the corridor's load-bearing architecture. It was not a punch in any human sense. It was a ballistic event wearing a coat, and it connected with Alucard's left shoulder and drove him sideways through the wall, into the adjacent office, through the office's interior partition, Into the next room. Leon tracked the path of destruction. 2 holes. Clean at the edges, the kind of damage that happened when something moved too fast for the building to process. And kept the shotgun up and did not fire because there was nothing to shoot at that. Wasn't already in a different room. The T-00 turned its head toward the holes in the wall. Waited. From the darkness of the second room, something laughed. It was not a pleasant laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had just been reminded of something they'd genuinely forgotten. The particular, almost nostalgic pleasure of impact, of force, of physics applied with conviction. It was the laugh of someone for whom being hit hard, enough to go through 2 walls, was not a problem but a data point. And the data point was interesting. Okay, Alucard said, from the darkness, with a warmth that had no business being in his voice given the context. Okay, yes, that's something. He came back through the wall, not through the holes, through the wall itself, the shadows preceding him like a personal weather system. The darkness of the room, behind him extending forward as if the geometry of light had decided to negotiate. He came through solid plaster and steel reinforcement, and the accumulated structural confidence of a building that had believed in itself until approximately this moment. And he was smiling, and the smile was the most frightening thing Leon had seen since arriving in Raccoon City, which was a significant achievement. The T-00 swung again. This time Alucard caught it. Not the way he'd caught the licker's tongue, not the casual, arm's-length management of something he'd already assessed as beneath his concern. He caught the tyrant's fist with both hands and held, and the corridor filled with the sound of force meeting immovable resistance. A sound like a thunderclap compressed into a space too small to contain it, and the floor cracked in a starburst pattern under Alucard's feet as the impact distributed itself somewhere. He held. The T-00 pushed. Its programming cycled through resistance protocols. It pushed harder. Alucard's feet moved back exactly 2 inches. He looked at the tyrant's fist in his hands. He looked at the tyrant's face. Something in his expression shifted from entertained to focused. And focused Leon was learning. A different register entirely. The difference between a man enjoying a game and a man deciding to end one. You're very strong, Alucard said, conversationally, to the tyrant. Relatively speaking. He twisted. The physics of what happened next were not available for independent review because they occurred too quickly for unaugmented human perception to follow. But the result was that the T-00 traveled the length of the corridor in the manner of a thing that had not chosen to travel and arrived at the far end wall with an impact that shook the building to its foundations and dislodged ceiling tiles for 2 floors in every direction. Dust. Silence. The distant sound of the pharmacist making a sound that was not quite a word. The T-00 was already getting up. Leon watched it rise from the crater it had made in the wall, slower than before. Something in its movement recalibrating. The adaptive processing that made tyrants genuinely dangerous kicking in as it assessed what had just happened and began rewriting its approach, parameters, and felt the specific, cold clarity of a professional assessment. This is what Umbrella sent for him specifically. It's going to adapt, Leon said. Yes, Alucard said, watching the tyrant rise with an expression of genuine appreciation, the way a musician might watch a difficult passage being played with unexpected competence. They do that. It's the best thing about them. That's not a good thing. Perspective, Alucard said. He drew both guns. The Jackal and the Casol came up simultaneously, and what followed was not a gunfight in any conventional sense because conventional gunfights involved participants who could be discouraged. The T-00 crossed the corridor, distance in 2 strides, and Alucard put 12 rounds into its center mass at range that made the concept of missing academic, and the tyrant absorbed them and kept coming because a tyrant class, BOW absorbed anti-tank rounds as a matter of professional pride. Alucard's smile sharpened. He sidestepped the grab, caught the tyrant's arm, and introduced its face to the floor 3 times in rapid succession, not with the casual management heat applied to the liquor, but with something that had intention behind it, the specific, escalating force of someone who was calibrating in real time, finding the edges of what this particular opponent could take and pressing on them with the curiosity of a researcher and the enthusiasm of someone who had been catastrophically bored for 45 minutes. The T-00's coat was in pieces. Its skin showed fracture patterns that biological tissue shouldn't show. Its adaptive processing was cycling faster than it was designed to cycle. And somewhere in the simple, mission-focused architecture of its programmed mind, something was encountering a category it didn't have a response for. It grabbed Alucard by the throat and lifted him off the floor. "Oh," Alucard said, from approximately 7 feet in the air with academic interest. "So that's the play." He let the shadows out. Not all of them. Not the full weight of what lived in the dark behind his eyes. Not the release states that turned him into something that the word monster wasn't adequate to describe. Just the edges. Just enough. The darkness pooled out of him like something that had been waiting for permission and was grateful for the limited opportunity. And the T-00's grip faltered, not from pain, because tyrants didn't process pain, but from something in its targeting architecture encountering stimulus it had no classification for. In that quarter second of falter, Alucard dropped, landed, and hit the tyrant with something that incorporated physics in a way that Leon's engineering knowledge suggested shouldn't be possible. And the T-00 went through the exterior wall, through it, into the open air, 3 stories up. The sound it made hitting the street below was significant. Alucard stood at the hole in the building's exterior wall, looking down, hands in his coat pockets. The October air coming through in a rush that smelled of smoke and the specific chemical signature of a city in terminal decline. He watched for a moment with the focused attention of a man waiting to see if something was going to get back up. A beat, too. From the street below, very faintly, the sound of something large beginning to move. "Good," Alucard said quietly to himself, in a tone that Leon was going to spend a long time thinking about. Not because it was frightening, though it was, but because underneath the genuine pleasure of it, there was something that sounded uncomfortably like relief. Like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time had finally, briefly, been allowed to exhale. Claire appeared at Leon's shoulder. She looked at the hole in the wall. She looked at Alucard. She looked at Leon. "We need to move," she said. "Whatever that thing is going to do when it gets back up, I'd rather not be here for it." "Agreed," Leon said. He looked at Alucard. "We're moving." Alucard turned from the hole in the wall. The focused expression was already receding, the familiar effect of mild amusement reasserting itself, like a mask being replaced out of habit. But something remained in his eyes, a quality that hadn't been there an hour ago, a faint, specific alertness that suggested the evening had upgraded its status from disappointing to potentially worth staying for. "The third-floor monitoring station," he said, as they moved back down the corridor toward the survivors. "We should visit it before we leave." Leon glanced at him. "Why?" "Because whoever is up there just sent a tyrant to collect me," Alucard said pleasantly. "And I'd like to have a conversation about that with them, in person." He paused. "I'll be very polite." "Will you?" "No," he admitted. "But I'll be interesting, which is better." The third-floor monitoring station had a door that believed in itself. Heavy-gauge steel, magnetic lock. Keypad entry with a 6-digit code that had been changed 3 times since the outbreak began because Operative Yates was thorough even in crisis, which was either admirable or the kind of professional dedication that deserved to be examined by a therapist in a quiet room far from Raccoon City. Security camera above the frame. Reinforced hinges. The general architectural philosophy of a room that had decided it was a vault and was committed to that identity. Alucard knocked. Not on the door. On the camera. He reached up with one finger and tapped the lens twice, with the gentle, specific courtesy of someone ringing a doorbell, and looked directly into it with an expression that communicated several things. Simultaneously, "I know you're in there, and I know you know I'm out here. And the door is a temporary condition rather than a permanent one. And I would like to discuss this calmly before it becomes a different kind of discussion." From inside, the sound of a chair moving. The sound of someone making a decision they didn't want to make. The magnetic lock disengaged. Leon had his hand on his holster. Claire was behind him with the survivors positioned at the stairwell entrance. Far enough for a head start if this went wrong, and close enough to hear it go wrong if it did. The door swung open on a room that smelled of cold coffee, and the specific anxiety of a man who had spent 11 months cataloging an atrocity and had finally been required to confront it directly. Yates was in his 40s, pale in the way of someone who worked under fluorescent lighting and considered that sufficient sun exposure, with the look of a man whose professional self-image had been constructed around competence and was currently being stress-tested past its rated capacity. He was unarmed. His hands were up. He had clearly made the calculation that the door was not going to save him and had elected to try transparency as an alternative strategy. He looked at Alucard. Alucard looked at him. "You sent the tyrant," Alucard said. "I redirected an existing deployment," Yates said, with the careful precision of someone who had decided that linguistic accuracy was load-bearing in this conversation. The T-00 was already active in the building. I requested it be assigned a secondary target. Me, you, because your anomaly detection protocol called me incalculable. Alucard moved past him into the room without being invited, which was the kind of thing he did, and surveyed the monitoring station with the unhurried assessment of someone cataloging an interesting environment. Screens showing RPD corridor feeds, an umbrella network terminal with a blinking uplink indicator, a satellite phone, a filing cabinet with a lock that had been used recently. How long has this station been operational? 11 months. Inside a police department. He said it without inflection, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with contempt. Watching the city prepare to eat itself. Yates said nothing. There was nothing to say. The silence was its own acknowledgement. Leon stepped into the room behind Alucard, reading the screens with the focused attention of someone whose job had just expanded dramatically and who was updating his professional priorities in real time. What the screens showed was not a monitoring station in any civic sense. It was a data collection apparatus, comprehensive and cold. Infection spread patterns, mapped with the precision of someone measuring a natural phenomenon they had released deliberately. Mortality rates, charted against variables that only mattered if you were planning to use the data for something, and a series of files marked with Umbrella's corporate identifier that Leon recognized from briefings that had been classified at a level 3 grades above his current rank. How many people know about this station? Leon said. In the building? None. The RPD command staff knew the 3rd floor east office was Umbrella leased research space. They didn't ask what the research was. Yates kept his hands up, kept his eyes on Alucard, kept the specific posture of someone who had decided that full disclosure was the only currency with exchange value in the current market. Outside the building, Regional Division Coordinator, 2 analysts at the Arkley Research Annex, and the team that activated the Dimensional Seal. The room went quiet in a particular way. The Dimensional Seal, Alucard said, turning from the screens. Yates's hands went slightly higher. The Arkley team was running a parallel research program. Dr. Spencer's personal mandate, evolutionary acceleration through unconventional biological vectors. The viral research was Division 1. The Arkley program was Division 2, classified above T-virus work, funded through a separate budget line that didn't appear in any document, connected to Umbrella's public pharmaceutical operations. He paused. Division 2 believed that biological evolution had a ceiling, that the viral approach, T-virus, G-virus, was optimization within existing parameters. They were looking for something outside the parameters. And they found it, Leon said. They found a theoretical framework for dimensional incursion, the idea that other planes of existence contained biological entities that had evolved under fundamentally different physical laws, and that introducing those entities to standard biological systems might catalyze evolutionary leaps impossible through conventional viral manipulation. Yates looked at Alucard with the expression of a man delivering a diagnosis he hadn't wanted to make. You weren't supposed to be retrieved. The seal was supposed to sample, take a cellular impression, a biological signature, enough data to work from. Something went wrong with the containment parameters, and instead of a sample, "You got me," Alucard said. "We got you. A beat. I want you to understand something," Alucard said. And his voice had changed, not louder, not harder, but lower, in the way that things went low when the Performance layers stripped back, and what was underneath it came forward. He moved to the umbrella network terminal and looked at the uplink indicator. With the focused expression Leon was learning to associate, with him having already decided something and working through the courtesy of explaining it before acting on it. The reason I'm speaking to you instead of doing something we'd both find unpleasant is that you opened the door. That was a choice, and choices have weight. And I've been alive long enough to respect the specific courage of a man who decides that transparency is less dangerous than a locked door. He looked at Yates. But I need you to understand that the organization you work for has decided I'm a research opportunity. And I find that, he paused, as if genuinely searching for the accurate word. Presumptuous. I understand, Yates said. Do you? It wasn't a question. I sent the tyrant because the protocol required it, not because I thought it would work. Yates lowered his hands, slowly, with the careful movement of someone testing whether the gesture was permitted. The protocol requires me to flag unclassified entities as potential threats and request containment. I flagged you. I requested containment. The T-00 was what was available. He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. I watched it go through a wall, 3 stories up. It got back up, Alucard said, not unkindly. I know. I have the street feed. He gestured at a screen in the lower bank that showed a downward angle view of the RPD's exterior, and on it, barely visible through the smoke and the dark, the T-00 was indeed back up, standing in the street below with the methodical, recalibrating patience of something that had updated its approach parameters and was preparing a second attempt. It'll find a way back in. I'm counting on it, Alucard said. He turned to the umbrella terminal. I'm going to look at your files now. Those are classified, yes. He sat down at the terminal with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had decided that classified was a category that applied to other people. You can tell me what I'm looking at, or I can work it out myself. One of those options is faster and involves you feeling useful. He looked at Yates, over his shoulder. I recommend it. Yates looked at Leon. Leon shrugged, with the expression of a man who had made his peace with the situation approximately 40 minutes ago and was conserving energy for problems he could actually solve. Yates sat down. What the files contained was worse than Leon had expected, which was a significant bar given that his expectations had already been recalibrated past several previous maximums. The Raccoon City outbreak wasn't an accident in any meaningful sense of the word. The T-virus contamination of the water supply had been a containment failure. Yes, but the containment failure had been allowed to develop past the point of intervention because someone in Umbrella's regional division had made the calculation that a contained urban outbreak provided data that laboratory conditions couldn't replicate: real infection spread rates, real behavioral mutation patterns, real mortality curves. The city was a petri dish. The people were the culture medium. Leon stood behind Yates's chair and read the files with the stillness of someone who was processing something that was going to change the shape of everything that came after, and did not speak and did not move, and kept his face composed through an act of professional. Well, that cost him more than he would have admitted. Claire appeared in the doorway. She read his expression. She looked at the screen. She read enough. She turned back to the survivors in the corridor and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the silence didn't already contain. The dimensional seal data, Alucard said, navigating the file structure with a speed that suggested he was either an exceptional typist or was doing something to the terminal that didn't involve typing in the conventional sense. Where is it? Arclay Annex server. This terminal has read access, but not full archive. Yates pulled up a directory. There's a secondary cache here. The team sent their preliminary findings to the city division before the outbreak cut communications. He opened the file, stopped, looked at the screen. What? Alucard said. They weren't just theorizing, Yates said, and his voice had changed in the way that voices changed when the information they were conveying had gotten ahead of the speaker's ability to process it. The Dimensional SEAL team, they had results. Prior results. Before you. He scrolled. 6 months ago. A smaller incursion. Something came through that they couldn't identify, couldn't contain, and he stopped scrolling. Lost. Lost, Leon said. Lost track of. It's in the city. Yates looked up. It's been in the city for 6 months. Whatever it is, it's been here since before the outbreak. And it's not in any of the infected population data, which means it's either dead or it's surviving, Alucard said. He said it with a quality that the room registered without being able to name. Not quite interest, not quite recognition, but somewhere between them. The specific alertness of someone who has heard a piece of information and is quietly rearranging other pieces around it. We need to move, he said, standing. The tyrant will be back inside in 4 minutes. The self-destruct protocol for this station. He looked at Yates. There is one panel behind the filing cabinet, activated on our way out. He looked at the satellite phone on the desk, picked it up, examined it, put it in his coat pocket, with the casual appropriation of someone taking something they've decided belongs to them now. And Yates, the operative, looked at him. Come with us, Alucard said. You opened the door. That still means something. He paused, and the pause had weight. For now, Yates looked at the screens, at the T-00 moving toward the building's exterior with recalibrated purpose, at the files that were going to destroy themselves in 4 minutes and take 11 months of careful, unglamorous, morally catastrophic work with them. He stood up. Okay, he said. Leon looked at him, then at Alucard, then at the door. For minutes, he said. 3 now, Alucard said pleasantly, and walked out. The sewers beneath Raccoon City smelled like the city had been keeping secrets down here for years, and the secrets had gone bad. This was, Leon reflected, accurate in every sense that mattered. The maintenance tunnels beneath the RPD connected to a network that the city's official infrastructure maps showed as storm drainage and waste management, and the various unglamorous hydraulic necessities of urban life, and that umbrella's internal documents, the ones Alucard had photographed with his eyes, apparently, in the monitoring station, because he had looked at each screen for approximately 2 seconds and had since been navigating the tunnels with the confidence of someone working from a memorized blueprint, showed as something considerably more deliberate. Access corridors, sample transport routes, emergency evacuation, paths for personnel who weren't supposed to be in the building they were evacuating from. The infrastructure of a corporation that had planned, from the beginning, to need underground exits. They moved in a formation that had organized itself without discussion. Leon on point with the shotgun, Claire and the survivors in the middle, Yates behind them with a handgun he'd taken from the monitoring station's emergency cache and was holding with the particular grip of someone who had been trained to use it and was hoping very hard not to need to. Alucard at the rear, which should have felt like a tactical liability and instead felt like the opposite. The specific comfort of knowing that whatever came from behind was going to encounter him first and would very likely not continue past him. The tunnels were not empty. They were never going to be empty. The T-virus had been in the water supply, which meant the water supply infrastructure was contaminated, which meant the things that moved through the water supply infrastructure were contaminated, and the things moving through these tunnels now had been maintenance workers and sewer personnel and Umbrella's own underground transport staff, and they were all zombies. And zombies in enclosed underground spaces with limited lighting, and the acoustic properties of concrete pipe were a specific and focused kind of terrible. Leon handled them with the economy of someone who had stopped thinking about what they were and started thinking purely about the geometry of engagement, angles, distances, the conservation of ammunition against an unknown quantity of targets in unknown tunnel length. He was good at it. He was getting better at it in the specific way that people got better at things they had no choice but to be good at. The accelerated competence of genuine necessity. And somewhere underneath the tactical processing, he was aware that this was changing him in ways he wasn't going to be able to fully account for until much later. Alucard watched him work and said nothing, which was the most respectful thing he'd done all evening. The tunnels branched at the third junction, left toward the sewage treatment infrastructure, right toward a section that wasn't on the city's official maps and was on Umbrella's internal documents, under a designation that translated when Alucard read it aloud, with the mild interest of someone identifying a wine vintage. as primary underground research facility, Raccoon City Division. We're not going right, Leon said. We need the surface exit, Claire said. The treatment plant has an exterior access point. I found it on the RPD emergency maps. It's left. Left, Leon confirmed. Right is more interesting, Alucard said. Right is Umbrella's underground lab, Leon said. Which is exactly where we're not going. The dimensional seal data said there was a prior incursion, something that came through 6 months ago and has been in the city since. He looked at the right tunnel with the focused attention that Leon had learned meant he was processing something he hadn't shared yet, something that survived the outbreak, that's been down here, or somewhere, for 6 months while the city died around it. That's not our problem right now, Leon said. It's going to be someone's problem eventually. Eventually is a problem for eventually. Leon turned left. We have survivors. We have a route. We're taking the route. A beat. In the middle distance of the right tunnel, something moved, not the shambling, hydraulic lurch of a zombie, not the fast surgical movement of a licker. Something else. Something with a different quality of motion. A deliberateness that the infected didn't have. A sense of navigation rather than pursuit. Everyone heard it. Everyone looked right. The movement stopped. Left, Alucard said, after a moment, and followed Leon without further argument, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd pushed the point. The treatment plant's lower access chamber was a cathedral of bad infrastructure, high concrete, ceilings disappearing into darkness, above networks of pipe that dripped with the specific persistence of things that had been dripping since before anyone currently alive had been born. Emergency lighting, in amber rather than red, that made everything look like it was being preserved in something, and a smell that was the unholy synthesis of industrial, chemical, and biological decay. It was also critically large, large enough that the thing currently occupying its center had room to be what it was without the space constraining it. William Birkin, or what had been William Birkin before the G-virus had conducted its aggressive editorial process on the concept of William Birkin, occupied the center of the chamber, with the specific territorial confidence of something that had decided this space was its, and had the biology to enforce that decision. The G-virus mutation had progressed past the early stages that Leon had read about in the classified file that he was now understanding, had been prepared by people who had watched this happen from a safe distance and written about it with the clinical detachment of people who had not expected to be in the same room as it. Stage 3, maybe 4. The human architecture was still present as an organizing principle, but had been extensively revised. One arm a grotesque, overdeveloped limb with an eye embedded in the shoulder that tracked, independently of the primary visual system, the musculature of the torso, rewritten by something that treated biological structure as a suggestion rather than a constraint. The movement pattern, that of a thing that had discovered it could be faster than it looked and was interested in that discovery. The eye and the shoulder found them, all of them, in sequence, with the specific, terrible intelligence of something that was still underneath the mutation, the mind of a man who had been a brilliant virologist, and that intelligence was now running on hardware that had been optimized for something entirely different from virology. Birkin, Yates said, very quietly, with the specific tone of someone who had read a file about a person and was now meeting the consequence of that file in person. You know him, Leon said. I knew of him. William Birkin, lead G-virus researcher. The outbreak started because someone tried to take his research. He injected himself with the G-virus rather than let it be taken. Yates's voice had the flatness of a man reading from a document in his memory, because looking at the source material directly was too much. The file said the mutation would be rapid, progressive, unpredictable. He looked at the thing in the center of the chamber. The file was correct. The G-mutant moved. It moved with the terrifying speed that large things weren't supposed to have, crossing half the chamber distance in a single motion that the eye struggled to follow. And Leon dove right, and Claire went left with the survivors, and Yates went wherever his legs decided to take him. And the G-mutant's primary arm came down on the space where they'd been standing with an impact that cracked the concrete floor in a pattern that radiated outward like a confession. Leon came up firing. Shotgun, center mass. 2 shells. The G-mutant registered the impacts. The way a large animal registered rain. With awareness, but not concern. The G-virus's regenerative cascade already working on the entry. Wounds with a speed that made ammunition conservation feel like a philosophical position rather than a tactical one. The eye, Alucard said, from somewhere above Leon. Above. Leon looked up. Alucard was on the pipe network, 6 feet off the ground, having apparently decided that vertical positioning was the correct response to a G-mutant in an enclosed space. And he was looking at Birkin's shoulder with the focused professional assessment of a man who had spent centuries identifying the structural weaknesses of things that didn't want to be killed. The eye in the shoulder is the G-virus's primary neural cluster for this mutation stage, Alucard said, with the calm authority of someone delivering a briefing. Damage to it disrupts the regenerative cascade. Not permanently. The virus will compensate, but long enough to matter. How do you know that? Leon said, reloading, not taking his eyes off the G-mutant. Because I can see its circulatory system from here, and I've been watching what it prioritizes protecting. He dropped from the pipes as the G-mutant turned toward his voice, landed on its back with a force that rocked the massive body sideways, and drove both hands toward the shoulder joint with the specific, targeted violence of someone who had identified the point and was going directly to it. The G-mutant screamed, not the vocalization of pain exactly. The G-virus had rewritten its relationship with pain along with everything else but the sound of a system encountering interference. It hadn't been designed to accommodate a frequency of biological protest that hit the chamber's concrete walls and came back changed. The regenerative cascade stuttered. Leon saw it. The wounds from the shotgun shells stopping their rapid closure, hanging open for a window of seconds that wouldn't last, but was there, was real, was something to work with. He put 4 shells into the eye. The G-mutant went down. Not permanently. The G-virus was already working, already compensating. The eye's damage triggering an adaptive response that was going to produce something worse than what they'd just fought. Because that was what the G-virus did. It used everything against you, including your victories, but down. And down was enough. Move, Alucard said, landing beside Leon with the easy balance of someone for whom jumping off large mutants was a normal activity. It won't stay down. They moved. Claire had the survivors to the far exit already. She'd found it during the fight, reading the chambers. Geography with the practical intelligence of someone who had decided that the best contribution she could make to a fight she couldn't, when was finding the way out of it. The exit was a maintenance ladder ascending to a surface access hatch, the kind of exit that existed in infrastructure for the occasional worker who needed to not use the main routes. And it was narrow, and it was steep, and it was the most beautiful thing Leon had seen all night. Behind them, from the center of the chamber, the sound of something very large, beginning the process of becoming something larger. It's adapting, Yates said, on the ladder above Leon. I know, Leon said. It's going to be different when it gets up. I know. Shouldn't we climb, Leon said. From below, as the hatch opened in cold Raccoon City air fell down into the tunnel like a benediction. Alucard's voice drifted up with the tone of a man who had stayed a moment longer than strictly necessary to observe something he found genuinely remarkable. Fascinating, he said, to William Birkin, or to the thing that was finishing the process of no longer being William Birkin. You keep changing. Every time something damages you, you become something the damage can't reach. He paused. I know exactly how that feels. He came up the ladder. He came up last, and when Leon pulled, the hatch closed behind him and the sounds from below became muffled and then distant. Alucard stood on the Raccoon City street in the cold October air and looked at nothing in particular with an expression that Leon couldn't read, not the performed blandness of his neutral face, not the sharp focus of combat assessment, not the entertained remove of his default effect, but something quieter and older and more honest than any of those. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then he looked up at the sky, smoke dark, orange at the edges where the city was burning, utterly indifferent, and said, in a voice that had no audience except himself and everything that had ever happened to him. Still, Leon didn't ask what it meant. Some things you heard and filed and returned to later, when you had the distance to understand them. Right now, they had a city to get out of. Nemesis found them on Circular Boulevard. This was not a coincidence. Nothing about Nemesis was a coincidence. It was the anti-coincidence. The deliberate, programmed negation of chance. A thing that had been made specifically so that certain people in certain places could not rely on the consolation of random survival. Its targeting architecture was not a hunting instinct, but a mission statement, written in cellular biology. And its mission statement tonight had been updated to include, alongside its primary SDRS directive, a secondary parameter that Yates had watched being uploaded from the monitoring station's terminal. Approximately 40 minutes before the monitoring station had destroyed itself, the secondary parameter was Alucard. They heard it before they saw it, the sound of its approach carrying through the burning city with the specific acoustic signature of something that weighed in excess of 600 pounds and had decided that the concept of stealth was beneath its operational dignity. A rhythmic, heavy percussion. That was not quite footsteps in the way. That a building falling was not quite a sound. More an event that happened to produce audio as a byproduct. The ground registered it. Car alarms that had been going off since the outbreak began changed their rhythm slightly in response. The way smaller instruments respond to a larger one entering the room. Leon heard it and recognized it from the briefing. The classified document that kept proving itself. That had been prepared by people who had watched Nemesis operate in field conditions and had written about it with the careful, clinical language of individuals who had been very far away when the field conditions occurred. Nemesis T-type, he said. Tyrant class, BOW mission programmed pursuit predator. Primary target is SDRS personnel. He looked at the group. Claire, not SDRS. The pharmacist, not SDRS. The teenage girl, not SDRS Yates. Umbrella, functionally the opposite of SDRS. None of us should be primary targets. Someone updated its parameters, Yates said. He said it with the tone of a man confessing to something he hadn't done personally but felt responsible for by organizational proximity. From the monitoring station. Before I came with you. The upload request came in on the priority line and he stopped. You approved it, Leon said. I was following protocol. Your protocol just aimed a pursuit predator at us. At him, Yates said, with a precision that was technically accurate and morally beside the point. From the far end of Circular Boulevard. Through the smoke, a shape resolved itself. From the darkness that had no business being that large. And was that large anyway. And Leon's threat assessment scale performed its fourth recalibration of the evening, moving Nemesis to a position that the scale hadn't previously had a number for. It was enormous. The T-00 had been enormous in the way of things built for size. This was enormous in the way of things built for purpose. Every dimension of it an engineering solution to the problem of how to make something unkillable and then aim it. The tentacle modification that distinguished the Nemesis T from standard Tyrant variants was coiled at its shoulder with the patient hydraulic readiness of something that knew it had time. It wore the remnants of a containment harness that had been designed to keep it manageable and had been accepted by Nemesis as a fashion choice rather than a constraint. It looked at them. Then it looked at Alucard. And Alucard looked back at it with an expression that did something Leon hadn't seen it do yet. It went completely, absolutely still. The performed effect in the managed distance and the layered irony all suspending simultaneously, replaced by something that was just attention, pure and total, the way very old things paid attention when they encountered something that reminded them of themselves. Oh, Alucard said, very softly. You're not just strong. Nemesis took one step forward. The boulevard registered it. You're angry, Alucard said. And there was something in his voice that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite sympathy, but lived in the neighborhood of both, the tone of someone identifying a quality in another creature that they understood from the inside. Someone took something from you and put it in a box and pointed it at things and called it purpose. He tilted his head. They did that to me once. Didn't take, but they tried. Alucard, Leon said. I know. We need to move the survivors. I know. He didn't move. Give me a moment. We don't have a. Nemesis launched the tentacle. It crossed the distance between them at a speed that made the T-00's assault feel leisurely, a whipping, targeted strike aimed with the precision of a system that had calculated trajectory, wind resistance, and target movement pattern in the fraction of a second before release. It hit Alucard in the chest and wrapped, and the impact drove him backward 40 feet and into a burning storefront that accepted him with a crash of glass and structural complaint and a tongue. A fire that briefly lit up half the block. Leon had already moved the moment the tentacle released, not away from Nemesis, but perpendicular to it, creating angle, pulling the pursuit predator's attention toward himself as a secondary target while Claire got the survivors to the overturned bus 20 meters down the boulevard that provided cover and a route to the service alley behind it. Nemesis turned toward Leon with the unhurried certainty of something that had processed him as a manageable interruption and would return to the primary target after. Leon shot it in the face. The Hydra shotgun, retrieved from the RPD armory and now the most valuable object in his possession, put 3 shells into Nemesis's upper mass at 15 feet, and Nemesis absorbed them with the expression of something that had been shot in the face considerably more times than Leon and had developed a philosophical position on the experience. It reached for him. Leon ran, not in panic, tactically, with direction and purpose, drawing Nemesis down the boulevard away from the survivors' position while keeping enough distance to stay operational. He knew he couldn't hurt it. The briefing had been explicit on this point. Nemesis T, in standard configuration, required sustained heavy weapons, fire to neutralize, and sustained heavy weapons. Fire was a category of resource that Raccoon City had stopped providing to people who needed it. Approximately 6 hours ago, what he could do was manage it, redirect it, by time. He was very good at buying time. Behind him, the burning storefront produced Alucard. He came through the fire the way he'd come through the wall earlier, the flames, parting with the specific deference of things that had learned better. His coat somehow both on fire and not on fire in a way that resolved itself as he moved into the cleaner air of the boulevard. The tentacle wound in his chest was closing, with a speed that made the word healing feel inadequate, the damaged tissue reversing its damage with the methodical thoroughness of a system that took biological insults personally. He looked at Nemesis. Nemesis looked at him. The pursuit predator recalculated. Leon, Alucard called, down the boulevard, without looking away from Nemesis. Leon stopped running. Yeah. The survivors are clear? Leon checked the alley entrance. Claire's signal, a single flash of her flashlight. The emergency code they'd established without discussing it. The kind of communication that happened between people who read situations the same way. Clear. Good. Alucard rolled his neck with the sound of someone preparing for something physical. Then I'm going to do something that you should not interpret as a comment on my general character. What does that mean? It means I'm going to enjoy this, Alucard said. And I want you to understand that the enjoyment is contextual. He moved. What followed on Circular Boulevard was not a fight in any sense that the word normally contained. A fight implied participants of comparable capability, engaging in a contest with an uncertain outcome. What happened between Alucard and Nemesis was something more like a negotiation conducted entirely in the language of catastrophic physical force, each party presenting arguments and receiving responses, and updating their position accordingly. The whole exchange, operating at a speed and scale that left the boulevard's infrastructure as collateral documentation. Nemesis was extraordinary. Leon watched it and understood, in a way the briefing hadn't conveyed, why it had been designated Nemesis, not because of its size or its strength or its mission programming, but because of its persistence. It adapted in real time. Not the cellular-level adaptation of the G-virus's mutation cascade, but tactical adaptation, pattern recognition, the recalibration of a system that had been designed to encounter resistance and route around it. Every time Alucard hit it, it adjusted. Every time it adjusted, Alucard hit it differently. Every time Alucard hit it differently, it adjusted again. It was, Leon thought, the most functional thing he'd seen all night. Alucard caught the tentacle on the second deployment, which Nemesis had apparently anticipated. Because the tentacles' trajectory changed mid-extension, in a way that tentacles shouldn't be able to change, and it wrapped around Alucard's arm instead of his torso and pulled. And Alucard went with the pull instead of against it, converting the kinetic energy into rotational momentum that brought him around and into Nemesis at a velocity that produced a sound like a building deciding to become rubble. They went through a pharmacy, through the wall of the pharmacy, into the street behind it, back through the wall. The pharmacy, which had been a pharmacy until approximately 30 seconds ago, expressed its structural objections and then stopped being a pharmacy. Yes, Alucard said, from inside the rubble, with a fervor that had no business being in a fight and was there anyway. Nemesis pulled itself from the debris with the patient systematic thoroughness of something that had been in rubble before and had opinions about the efficient way to exit it. Its containment harness had torn. Its coat was gone. Its surface was showing damage. That was not regenerating. At the rate the T-00's damage had regenerated, and Leon filed this. The Nemesis TS regeneration was slower than baseline Tyrant. The cost of the enhanced mission programming and the tentacle modification, and all the other additions that had been made to produce something that was more than a Tyrant. The damage wasn't stopping it, but it wasn't nothing. The RPD had a rocket launcher in the evidence lockup, Yates said, appearing at Leon's shoulder, which meant he'd come back when the survivors were clear, which Leon noted and filed for later consideration. Confiscated from an umbrella transport 3 months ago. I logged it. It should still be there. The RPD is on the other side of Nemesis, Leon said. The sewers connect to the evidence lockup subbasement. There's an access panel in the treatment plant chamber. The one we just came from. The one with the G-mutant. Yes. Leon considered this for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not long. How certain are you about the rocket launcher? I logged it myself, Yates said. 11 months ago, in a locked cage in the evidence subbasement. He paused. I'm very thorough. From the rubble of the former pharmacy, Nemesis had located Alucard again and was pursuing, with the recalibrated determination of something that had processed everything that had happened in the last 4 minutes, and had arrived at a new approach, that it was committed to testing. Alucard was letting it get close. Leon watched him do it, maintaining just enough distance to stay ahead, drawing Nemesis's attention and its energy, wearing it down in the specific way that only something genuinely unkillable could afford, to wear down an unkillable thing. He was a matador working a bull that outweighed him by 500 pounds, and he was doing it with the relaxed, economical movement of someone who had decided to enjoy the process. He glanced at Leon as he passed. Getting the rocket launcher, Leon called. Alucard's expression, in the half-second of eye contact, communicated something that Leon translated as finally. Yes. Good. That's the correct move. Go. Don't die, Leon added. Alucard smiled, retreating down the boulevard with Nemesis in pursuit behind him, communicated something that Leon translated as I find that concern genuinely touching and also completely unnecessary and also keep it. Leon turned to Yates. Show me the access panel. The evidence subbasement smelled like 11 months of institutional neglect and one very specific recent development involving a G-mutant that had upgraded itself through the ceiling 2 floors above and left traces of its biological ambition dripping through the ventilation system in ways that Leon chose not to examine closely. The rocket launcher was exactly where Yates had said it would be. Leon stood in front of the evidence cage and looked at it with the specific gratitude of a man who had spent the entire evening operating on the assumption that things were not going to be where he needed them and was recalibrating. RPG 7, Umbrella modified, with 2 warheads in the cage beside it that had been confiscated from a transport that had been moving them somewhere for reasons that the evidence log described as under investigation, and that Leon now understood meant Umbrella was taking them to a facility that didn't officially exist for a purpose that wouldn't be filed anywhere. He broke the cage with the bolt cutters from the maintenance room adjacent, loaded the first warhead with the focused efficiency of a man who had been trained for this and was grateful the training covered it, and looked at Yates. How many shots does Nemesis take? He said. The field data on Nemesis termination is, Yates started. How many shots? At least 2, possibly more. The T-type enhanced regeneration means the first shot disrupts but doesn't terminate. You need sustained. 2 warheads, Leon said. Okay, there's a third in the upper cage. I can get it if. Get it, Leon said, and was already moving back toward the access panel. The G-mutant was not in the treatment plant chamber when they came back through it, which was worse than if it had been there because it meant it was somewhere else. And somewhere else in an enclosed underground infrastructure system with limited sight lines and the acoustic properties of an echo chamber was a category of tactical problem that Leon's training addressed under the heading unfavorable engagement conditions, and his instincts addressed under the heading move faster. They moved faster. The surface access hatch opened onto a Raccoon city that had continued its evolution toward complete systemic failure. In their absence, more fires, more structural collapses in the middle distance, the sound of something large falling in the commercial district to the east that was either a building or a very large BOW making a very large decision. The sky above was the color of a city's last night, orange-black and smoke-thick, and the stars weren't visible. And Leon found that he didn't miss them because the stars felt like a category of thing that existed in a different conversation than the one he was currently having. Circular Boulevard was a documented disaster. 2 blocks of it, from the pharmacy that wasn't to the intersection at Memorial Drive, had been redesigned by the ongoing engagement between Alucard and Nemesis in the specific way that things got redesigned when the forces involved had stopped caring about the built environment as a constraint. Cars moved. Storefronts opened. The street surface itself showed the cumulative record of what had passed over it, in the form of impact craters and claw gouges, and the long sliding marks of things that had been moving very fast and had stopped very suddenly. Leon tracked the engagement by sound and damage pattern, reading the boulevard the way his training had taught him to read a battlefield. Not just the current positions, but the history of movement. The logic of the exchange, where force had been applied and where it had been deflected and where the contested ground was. He found them at the Memorial Drive intersection. Nemesis had Alucard against the base of the intersection's traffic control tower, and the tower was losing its structural argument with the forces being applied to it. And Alucard was doing something that Leon needed a moment to parse, because it didn't fit any category of combat behavior he had a framework for. He was letting it happen, not in the sense of being overwhelmed. The distinction was clear to anyone watching closely. The difference between someone being beaten and someone choosing to receive force, rather than spend the energy deflecting it. Nemesis was hitting him and he was taking it, and the shadows around him were doing something that wasn't quite defense and wasn't quite absorption. The darkness pooling at the points of impact like a material that had decided to participate in the exchange on his behalf. And Nemesis was tiring. Leon wouldn't have believed it if he weren't watching it. The pursuit predator's movements had changed, still powerful, still targeted, still mission committed, in the way that Nemesis T was. Mission committed at the cellular level, but fractionally slower. The adaptive recalibration cycling faster than it was designed to cycle. The enhanced regeneration that made it extraordinary. Burning energy it hadn't been designed to burn at this rate, because nothing had ever required it to burn this fast for this long. Alucard had been doing this on purpose. He'd been wearing it down for the entire duration of their absence, not fighting to win, but fighting to cost, spending his own invulnerability as a resource, absorbing what Nemesis could produce and returning enough to keep it engaged and burning. Leon raised the RPG. Alucard looked at him over Nemesis's shoulder, and the expression on his face in that moment was the clearest. Leon had seen it all evening, not performed, not managed, just direct. The communication of one person to another across a distance and a burning city, saying something that didn't have a word for it, but that Leon translated as, now. He fired. The first warhead hit Nemesis in the upper back at the junction of its enhanced spinal modification and the tentacle housing, the specific point that Yates had identified from the field data as the highest concentration of the T-types, enhanced nervous architecture. And the detonation was not large in absolute terms, but was precisely located. And precise location was the entire argument. Nemesis staggered. Not fell, staggered, the massive body absorbing the explosion with the stubborn, programmatic refusal to go down. That was the whole point of it. But the regeneration disrupted, the adaptive cycling crashing into the concurrent damage from the sustained engagement with Alucard, the system encountering two simultaneous demands it had been designed to handle sequentially and could not process in parallel at the required rate. Alucard hit it, not the calibrated, exploratory force of earlier in the evening, but something that didn't have a comfortable name. The full weight of 500 years in the darkness behind them applied to a single point at a moment of genuine structural vulnerability. The sound it made was not in any register Leon had encountered before. The traffic control tower did not survive being adjacent to it. Nemesis went to one knee, on the ground, the first time it had been on the ground since Circular Boulevard had become what it currently was. Second shot, Alucard said, stepping back from it, and his voice had a quality that it hadn't had all evening. Not the performative enthusiasm of the T-00 encounter, not the academic interest of the Birkin chamber, but something quieter and more honest. The voice of something that had worked hard and knew it. Leon reloaded, fired. The second warhead was less precise and more comprehensive, and Nemesis received it from a distance of 20 feet. And what followed was the kind of silence that happens when something very loud stops happening, and the world needs a moment to remember what quiet was. The smoke cleared. Nemesis was down and still, which was different from dead in ways that Leon understood and filed for later, but down and still in the regeneration that had been cycling throughout the engagement had run into a deficit it was going to need time to address, and time was a resource that Raccoon City was going to stop providing to everything in it before that regeneration completed. Leon lowered the RPG. His hands were steady. He noted this with the distant, observational part of his mind that had been running commentary on his own psychological state all evening, because steady hands at this particular moment were either a good sign or a concerning one, depending on what they indicated about his capacity to process what was happening. Alucard was looking at Nemesis with that expression again, the one from the G-mutant chamber, the quiet, honest one. It'll get back up, Leon said. Eventually, Alucard said, before the missile strike. A pause. Probably. Then we need to be out of the city before it does. Alucard nodded, once, which was the most straightforwardly agreeable thing he'd done since Innerdale Street. They found Claire and the survivors in the service alley 2 blocks east, where she'd kept them calm and quiet and oriented with the specific, focused competence of someone who had decided that the most useful thing she could be right now was the person who didn't panic, and had been that person for the duration. The pharmacist was sitting on a crate, with his hands between his knees, and the expression of a man who had updated his priors about the world so many times tonight that he'd run out of space and was just holding the information until he could find somewhere to put it. The girl was standing against the wall with her arms crossed and the expression of someone processing something profound and not yet ready to share what it was. Yates produced the third warhead from his coat pocket, which answered the question of whether he'd retrieved it, and handed it to Leon without comment. The highway overpass, Claire said when Leon arrived, north of the commercial district. Emergency services had a staging area there before communications went dark. There should be vehicles, supplies. She looked at Leon's face and then at Alucard and then back at Leon. Did it work? For now, Leon said. For now is enough. She looked at the group, the survivors, Yates, Leon, and the impossible figure in the red coat who was standing slightly apart from the group, with his hands in his pockets, looking north toward the part of the city that was burning more comprehensively than the rest, with an expression that had gone somewhere Leon didn't have a map for. Let's move. They moved. The route to the overpass took them through 4 blocks of Raccoon City that had reached the late stages of what they were. The streets almost entirely clear of the living and populated by the infected in the specific, drifting, purposeless way of things that had lost the organizing principle of hunger, because hunger implied something to hunt, and there was almost nothing left to hunt. The zombies ignored them or turned toward them too slowly to matter, or were managed by Leon and Claire with the quiet, methodical efficiency of people who had stopped, thinking about what they were doing, and were simply doing it. Alucard was quiet for 3 blocks. On the 4th block, without looking at Leon, he said, I heard something in the tunnels. The G-mutant. Before the G-mutant. Something else. The prior incursion. He paused. It was following us. Leon kept walking. Following. Not pursuing. Following. There's a distinction. He looked at Leon briefly. Whatever came through the seals 6 months ago, it's been surviving down here. In the dark. Alone. He stopped. In the middle of a street that had become a graveyard. And looked back the way they'd come, toward the tunnels. Toward the darkness below the burning city. It let us pass. Leon stopped. Why would it do that? Because it recognized something, Alucard said. And his voice was doing the quiet, honest thing again. I don't know what. Something in the group, or in the situation. He paused. Or in me. The satellite phone from the monitoring station produced a sound. Alucard took it from his pocket and looked at it. An incoming call on the umbrella priority line. He answered it. Put it on speaker without being asked. Because he had apparently decided that Leon should hear this. Which was the most direct acknowledgement of partnership he'd offered all evening. The voice on the other end was not Yates's regional coordinator. It was a different voice entirely. Cooler, more deliberate. With the specific quality of someone who chose every word the way a chess player chose every move. For implications that extended beyond the immediate exchange. This is quite impressive, the voice said, with a warmth that was entirely constructed. I've been watching your evening's work with considerable interest. The T-00. The G-mutant. The Nemesis T. A pause. You're something genuinely new, aren't you? Alucard said nothing. I'd like to offer you something, the voice continued. Not containment. Clearly that's not a productive conversation. A conversation, instead, about what you are, what this city has shown you, and what comes next. Another pause, perfectly timed. My name is Weskier, Albert Weskier, and I think you and I have considerably more in common than you currently believe. The burning city crackled around them. Alucard looked at the phone. Then he looked at Leon, with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, assessment, amusement, and underneath both of them, something that was paying very close attention. Hold that thought, he said, into the phone, and hung up. The highway overpass was exactly what Claire had said it would be, and nothing more than that, which was enough. 3 emergency services vehicles, 2 RPD patrol units, and an ambulance that had been staged for a mass casualty response that had exceeded its operational parameters. Approximately 6 hours into the outbreak, sat in the staging area under the overpass, with the abandoned quality of things that had been left in a hurry by people who had made the calculation that the vehicles were less important than the direction away from the vehicles. Keys. In 2 of the 3. Fuel gauges showing enough. A medical kit in the ambulance. That Claire went through, with the focused efficiency of someone, conducting triage on their options and selecting the ones that mattered. The overpass itself provided cover from the sky, which mattered because the sky above Raccoon City was no longer just smoke and fire but had acquired, in the last hour, the specific quality of a sky that was being watched from above by things with military designations and operational timelines. Leon had heard the aircraft twice. High altitude. The sound of surveillance rather than immediate action. The sound of a decision being made at a remove from the consequences of making it. 72 hours, Alucard had said, on Innerdale Street. Leon was revising that estimate downward. He sat on the hood of the less damaged patrol unit and watched the group organize itself around the immediate necessities of departure. Claire checking the survivors' condition with the practical compassion of someone who had decided that compassion and efficiency were not competing priorities. The pharmacist, gradually returning from wherever the shock had taken him and becoming useful in the way that people with specific knowledge became useful when the situation required that knowledge. The girl sitting in the ambulance's open back with a blanket around her shoulders and the expression of someone who had decided that processing would happen later and had filed a very large item in the later folder. Yates was checking the fuel. He did it with the methodical thoroughness that Leon was learning was his default mode. The same thoroughness that had run a monitoring station for 11 months, that had logged a rocket, Launcher in an evidence cage with the care of someone who understood that logged things stayed findable, that had opened a door when a locked door was the alternative. He was a man who had worked for something monstrous and had been, within that work, genuinely competent and genuinely careful. And what you did with that combination was a question. Leon filed next to several other questions that the evening had generated and that weren't going to get answered tonight. Alucard was standing at the overpass railing, looking south at the city. Leon went and stood beside him. The view from the overpass was the kind of thing that changed your relationship with the word city. The grid of streets visible, in the spaces between the smoke and the fire, the buildings that were still standing, asserting their geometries against the ones that weren't anymore. The distant movement of the infected in the streets below, rendered small by distance and somehow more terrible for it. The specific quality of a place that had been alive and was now in the process of becoming something else. A fact, a before and after, a thing that would be referred to in documents with the word incident and inhuman memory with no word at all because no word had been designed for it. He knew about the prior incursion, Leon said. Wesky. Alucard's voice was neutral, thinking. He knew about the dimensional seal program. He knew what you were before you answered the phone. Leon looked at the city. He's been watching longer than the monitoring station was. He's been watching longer than the outbreak, Alucard said. The monitoring station was Umbrella's eyes. Weskier has his own eyes. They overlap, but they're not the same. He was quiet for a moment. He's not calling from inside Raccoon City. No, he let the city happen. He watched it happen, and he's calling from somewhere. Clean and dry and very well informed. Which means he had access to everything. Umbrella knew and chose not to use it to stop anything. He looked at his hands on the railing, gloved, still. The picture of composed attention. I've met men like that. Men who watch catastrophes. They could prevent because the catastrophe is more useful to them than the prevention. Spencer, Leon said. Oswald Spencer, Umbrella's founder. The outbreak was his company's product. Weskier isn't Spencer, Alucard said. Spencer built something. Weskier is waiting to take it apart. He paused. He thinks we have something in common. Because we're both old things, wearing human shapes and operating outside the rules that apply to ordinary people. His voice didn't change, but something in it did. A quality shift so subtle it was almost not there. He's wrong about the common ground. But he's right that I'm paying attention. Leon looked at him. You're not going to call him back. Not tonight. A pause. Not from a position of needing something from him. He has information about the prior incursion. He has information about everything. Alucard turned from the railing. That's the problem with men like that. They make themselves indispensable through the accumulation of things other people need. And then the question of what they want for it is the only question that matters. He looked at Leon with the direct, unmanaged expression that Leon had learned to read as the register where Alucard was saying something he actually meant. I don't know what he wants yet. Until I know what he wants, I'm not giving him a conversation. That's surprisingly reasonable, Leon said. I'm occasionally reasonable, Alucard said. Don't make it a personality. From the south, the aircraft sound changed. Closer now. More deliberate. The specific quality of a transition from surveillance to something with an operational phase. Time to go, Leon said. Yes. They didn't move immediately. It was 30 seconds, maybe 40. Both of them looking at what remained of Raccoon City with the specific, silent acknowledgement of people who had been through something together and were standing at the edge of what came after it. Not sentiment, not ceremony, just the honest recognition that the before and after of an evening like this required a moment of demarcation, a breath between the thing that happened and the thing that happened next. Leon thought about the files in the monitoring station that had burned with the station's self-destruct, the data on the outbreak, the spread models, the mortality curves, the corporate calculation that had treated a city as a variable. He thought about Yates, who had logged those files for 11 months and was now standing 20 feet away checking a fuel gauge, and about what accountability looked like in a world where the institution capable of providing it had also been the institution that had made the thing that needed accounting for necessary. He thought about the girl in the ambulance, who was 17 at most, and had a very large item in her later folder, and about the fact that later was going to arrive whether she was ready for it or not. He thought about what Claire had said, 3 blocks from the overpass, when the survivors were moving and the noise of the city was briefly distant. We get out first. We figure out the rest after. He had agreed. He still agreed. And he was aware that the rest was going to be very large and was going to require a different set of tools than the ones that had gotten him through the last 7 hours. The prior incursion, he said. Whatever's still down there. Still down there. Alucard confirmed. Alive. Surviving. Letting things pass. He paused. It'll come out when it decides to. Whatever it is. Another pause. And when he spoke, again his voice had the quality of someone noting something for the record. It felt like something that had been alone for a very long time and was deciding whether to stop being alone. That sounds familiar, Leon said. Alucard looked at him. The expression that crossed his face at that moment was not the performed amusement or the focused combat, assessment or the quiet honesty. It was something that didn't have a category yet, something that Leon filed under new data. Incomplete, returned to later, and that Alucard handled by looking back at the city and saying nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Leon. Claire's voice from the vehicles. We're ready. He pushed off the railing, looked at Alucard. You're coming. It wasn't a question. Alucard's expression registered this. The infection never truly ends, Alucard said, as if testing how the phrase felt in his mouth, as if he'd heard it somewhere and was deciding whether it was true. He looked at Raccoon City one last time, the burning grid of it, the geometry of a place in the process of becoming a lesson, and something in his face did the thing it had done in the treatment plant chamber, the thing that was too old and too honest to be anything except what it was. No, he said quietly to the city, to the October sky, to the 500 years of things he carried and the 7 hours of things he'd added to them tonight. It doesn't. He turned from the railing. They walked back to the vehicles together, Leon and Alucard, through the underpass, dark with its smell of concrete and exhaust and the distant chemical signature of a city burning itself clean, of its own history. Claire had the patrol unit running. Yates was in the back with the pharmacist. The girl had moved from the ambulance to the rear seat of the patrol unit and was looking out the window at nothing. Leon got in the driver's seat. Alucard got in the passenger seat and sat with the specific quality of someone who had not been a passenger in anything for a very long time and was deciding how he felt about it. Seatbelt, Leon said. A pause. I'm immortal. Seatbelt, Leon said. Alucard put on the seatbelt with the expression of a man making a concession that he found more meaningful than it had any right to be. Leon pulled out of the staging area and onto the overpass and drove north, away from Raccoon City, toward the dark of the highway and the uncertain geography of what came after. Behind them, through the rear window, the city lit the sky orange and scent. It smoke upward like something it needed to say and hadn't found the language for yet. In the ambulance following behind, Yates sat with his hands between his knees and thought about 11 months and a locked door he'd opened and where the line was between the thing he'd been and the thing he was now, and didn't reach a conclusion, because conclusions of that kind required distance that he didn't have yet and might not have for a very long time. 3 miles north of the city perimeter, the aircraft sound changed for the final time. Leon watched the mirror. The flash came first, then the sound, then the concussive pressure that moved through the patrol unit like a wave through water. And Raccoon City was behind them in every sense of the word, which was the only sense that mattered for the next several hours, and the only sense that several of them would ever fully achieve. Alucard looked in the mirror. He looked at it for a long time, at the fire that was larger than the fire had been, at the geometry of the city going from being a city to being a different kind of fact, at the October sky that was now the color of an ending. His expression was not readable. Leon didn't try to read it. He drove. The highway went north, and the night went with them, and the thing that had been in the tunnels, the prior incursion, the 6-month survivor, the presence that had followed them through the underground dark and let them pass and watch them go, remained below the burning city, in the flooded corridors, in the dark, waiting. The umbrella priority line satellite phone in Alucard's coat pocket was silent. For now, in a server facility in a location that did not appear on any map that the public had access to. A terminal displayed a file that had been opened 20 minutes ago and was being updated in real time by an analyst who had excellent instincts and no moral imagination whatsoever. At the top of the file, a classification header, priority research target, unclassified biological entity, Raccoon City contact confirmed. Below it, a name. Below the name, in the field reserved for threat assessment, a single word that the analyst had typed, and then stared at for a full minute before deciding it was accurate. Incalculable. Below that, in the field reserved for operational notes, in handwriting that was not the analyst's because the annotation had been added from a different terminal by someone with a different level of access and a very specific interest in the file subject. Make contact again. On his terms if necessary. On ours if possible. W. The file stayed open. The infection never truly ends. In the weeks that followed, Leon Kennedy filed a report with the DSO that described the Raccoon City outbreak in terms that were accurate, comprehensive, and classified above the level at which accurate, comprehensive reports typically remained classified for long. It described the T virus, Umbrella's culpability, the G mutant, the Nemesis T, and the government's decision to sanitize the city with language that was measured and precise and carried underneath it the specific weight of a man who had decided that measured and precise was the only way to make sure the weight got where it needed to go. He described Alucard in one line: unknown allied entity, non-standard biological classification, instrumental in survivor extraction. He did not describe what Alucard was, or what Alucard had done on Circular Boulevard, or what Alucard had said at the overpass railing, because some things needed to find their own classification before they could be filed correctly, and this was one of them. The prior incursion was never recovered from the tunnels beneath Raccoon City. The tunnels were destroyed when the city was. Whatever had survived 6 months in the dark was gone with everything else. Or wasn't, and the distinction was a question that nobody with the authority to investigate it had yet decided was worth the budget. Yates gave his full deposition to a DSO officer who met him in a parking garage in a city he didn't name and had the professional expression of someone who had heard worse and was prepared to hear it again. The deposition was classified. Yates was relocated under a name that doesn't appear in this account. He remained thorough. Albert Weskier's file on the unclassified entity grew, and somewhere north of a city that was now a crater, and a lesson and a before and after. A passenger in a patrol unit looked out the window at a highway going somewhere and thought about a phone call he hadn't returned, and about a prior incursion that had followed them through the dark and let them pass, and about a rookie cop who had pointed a gun at him on Interdale Street and not put it down, and decided that the world he'd landed in was, against every reasonable expectation, not boring at all. The infection never truly ends. More stories await.